First, I'd like to thank very much Dr. Jablonski and the Oscar Halecki Institute, including Mrs. Kemka and Mrs. Bojena Serafin, who helped me with the production of this deck that you are about to see. And I'd also like to thank very much Mr. Ambassador for your very kind and informative words. I am very honored to have this opportunity to speak today about the story of the Katyn massacre and a part about the books that have been written about it in English that are the subject of this annotated bibliography that I published last year. My father was among the speakers when the Katyn monument was unveiled at the corner of Roncesvalles and Queen Street in Toronto in September of 1980. And I remember that event very clearly because I was in the audience in the street, and it was a huge crowd. And my 95-year-old father, when I told him that I was going to be making this presentation and had the honor of following in the agenda behind following the Polish ambassador, he was thrilled to know that the younger generation doesn't forget. So let's get on with it. There's a lot of stuff to cover and there's never enough time. What I'd like to do is divide this presentation in two parts. One is an overview of the Katyn Forest Massacre history, and the second is an overview of some of the classic pieces of literature published in English about the tragedy. So we begin with the discussion of when the war started, what happened, who did what to who. Too many books, particularly in Canada and the West, refer to the beginning of the war as the German invasion of Poland and the suggestion that Poland was defeated by Germany alone and that its entire country was occupied by the Germans. This, of course, is not true. August 23rd, 1939 was the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which was a non-aggression pact, which was made public and shocked the world. But what was not made public were the secret protocols. The American and the Allies only found them at the end of the war when they captured the Nazi Foreign Office documentation. And what the protocols do is outline the respective spheres of influence, which included, of course, the division of Poland and the assignment of Bessarabia and the Baltic states to the Soviet Union. So on September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany had the green light from Stalin to start the war. They occupied their half. On September 17th, the Soviets invaded Poland from the east and occupied their half. A boundary agreement was signed on the 28th with some minor adjustments. And in the end, the Soviets occupied more than half of Poland and the Germans slightly less. At that time, the Soviets captured approximately 250,000 or so Polish soldiers, and they very quickly identified which ones were the officers, and these were subsequently sent to 3 camps. Doesn't want to do it. Nope. There. That's it.
It's okay.
Thank you. So the Polish officers were at 3 NKVD camps. 3 of them, Kozielsk, Starobielsk, and Ostashkov. At Kozielsk and at Starobielsk, you had the military who were mostly either full-time military officers or, as the ambassador mentioned, reservists who were in regular civilian careers, either engineers or doctors, lawyers, judges, teachers, professors, and so on. So at Kozielsk, there were 4,500. At Starobielsk, where my grandfather was, were 3,800. And at Ostashkov, there were mostly Poles who were members of the border guard, the police, the gendarmes, and so on. So altogether, there were in fact around 10,000 officers at Kozelsk and Starobielsk, and with the three camps, there was about 15,000 officers. During the time that they were held in these camps, they were each subjected to interrogations by NKVD officers and asked about their past history, militarily and politically. Of course, the Soviets were looking for those who had participated in the Polish Bolshevik War and those who had engaged in anti-Soviet political parties and activities. Now, in 1940, at the beginning of February, there was the first of 4 mass deportations of Poles to Siberia and Kazakhstan. The second was in April, the third in June and July, and a fourth in June of 1941. In total, it's estimated over 1 million, quite possibly 1.5 million Poles were subjected to deportations. Now, the thing is that during the period that the Polish officers were held at the 3 camps, the NKVD allowed them at one point to start sending letters or postcards to their families. This gave the NKVD the addresses of their families. And the second wave of deportations included the arrest and deportation of the members of the families of the Polish officers at the camps. When I asked my father, why is it that he and his mother had not been arrested by the NKVD and deported, he told me that he had the good fortune in that sense of living in the German zone of occupation and not the Soviet zone. So that's one example of where being out of the clutches of the Soviets was good omen. On March 5th, Beria provided Stalin, this is the NKVD chief, with a memo indicating that all of the Polish officers who had been interrogated were determined to be anti-Soviet, and he recommended that they all be punished by being shot. Beria provided this to Stalin, and it was signed by Stalin and other members of the Politburo. However, he not only indicated that the 15,000 Polish prisoners at the 3 camps should be shot, but also another 10,685 Poles that were in camps or prisons in Western Belarusia and Western Ukraine. And these Poles were among the elite as well. They were typically, business owners, landowners, local politicians, and the local elite who were also interrogated and determined to be anti-Soviet. So the Katyn Forest massacre began in April and ended in May. And according to a memo of KGB Chief Shelepin from 1959, although the previous memo by Beria suggested that 25,000 should be shot, his memo in 1959 to Khrushchev indicated that the total number of victims of this Katyn operation was 21,857. And here is a map that I found on the internet. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, but it's probably the best illustration that I have seen to date of what this Katyn operation involved. So we see in the top right corner that Ostashkov, the prisoners were taken in small groups by train to Kalinin, which is now known as Tver. They were taken to the NKVD building and in the basement in soundproof rooms were individually shot and their bodies taken and buried in mass graves in Midnoye. Those in Kozelsk, slightly below that, were taken by train past Smolensk to a little station called Gnezdovo. And from there, in batches, they were taken by bus to a blacked out bus, Black Raven, to the execution site, and were buried in the pits, the mass graves at Katyn. And below that, and in fact in Ukraine, those at Starobielsk were transferred in batches to the NKVD building in Kharkov, where they were murdered, and then their bodies were dumped in the mass graves in the outside of town in the woods known as Piatychatki. And you see from the green arrows a number of places where there were prisons, where Polish prisoners, the other 10,000, were taken to other sites where they were executed and buried as well. Unfortunately, the information about the details of where they were from and where they were taken is not fully disclosed and not known. 1941, June 22nd, the Nazis launch Operation Barbarossa and the entire political situation changes. Now the Soviets are involved in a common struggle with the Western Allies in the struggle against Nazi Germany. And on July 30th, the famous Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement was signed between the Polish government in exile and the Soviet Union, in which the Soviets agreed to release the Poles who were kept in captivity. And they referred to this as an amnesty, although the Poles had not committed any crime. And they also allowed for a Polish army to be created. On August 4th, General Anders was released from the Lubyanka, and he was allowed to assume command of the army that was gathering in Buzuluk. Now, at that time, of course, all of those soldiers who had been captured and all the Poles who had been deported in the waves of immigration were supposed to be released. If they were all alive, presumably about 1.5 million Poles would show up in Buzuluk. In the end, only a very small fraction, in fact, showed up. I think it's British journalist or the academic who wrote the book God's Playground.
Norman Davies.
Norman Davies estimated that approximately half of the Poles who had been deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan were dead by the end of the first winter, all from overwork, starvation, and disease. So one of the things that the Poles forming the army in Buzuluk were expecting, of course, was the officers to be released and to show up. And as time went on, it became clear that they weren't showing up. Now, Anders then set up a documentation and search office. And this is really, really important because the documentation that was collected ends up being for historians an extremely valuable resource. All of the soldiers who showed up and the families were all asked to fill out, sort of questionnaires and to describe what they had endured, what they had seen. And they were all asked, have you seen any of the Polish officers? And this reminds me very much of, Ringelblum's archives, the Oneg Shabez in the Warsaw Ghetto, where he tried to document everything that had been done in the Warsaw Ghetto by the Nazis to the Jews, and then buried them in these metal cartons underneath the ground, only to be discovered after the war and to provide a tremendous wealth of resource. Well, all of this documentation that Anders Documentation Center received is now, of course, at the Hoover Institution in Stanford and available to historians. One thing that Anders did was ask a number of his staff, including an officer by the name of Chapsky, Joseph Chapsky. he gave him a letter of introduction and asked him to search, literally search in the Soviet Union for these missing officers. Now, in 1942, as the situation with the soldiers that were forming this army was very poor, in the sense that they were all in terribly poor health and had little food and not enough resources with which to train, Stalin met with Anders, and Anders convinced him to allow them to leave through the Persian corridor. And Stalin agreed to the evacuation in March, more evacuation in July. However, restrictions were placed, and the last of the Poles escaped with the Anders army. In total, there was 115,000 Poles, the majority they're soldiers, but many family members and civilians along with them. And none of the, of course, officers from the three camps. Apart from, I should have mentioned earlier, there were 400 in total from the three camps who were not executed during the Katyn massacre, but who were transferred to a camp known as Griazovets. And they were joining the Anders army, except for one group with Zygmunt Berlin, who defected and became a Soviet puppet. Now, 1943, the Nazis discovered the mass grave in the Katyn forest, and on the April 13th, announced to the world on Berlin radio that they had discovered this mass grave, and they estimated the total to be 10,000 bodies. In fact, there were 4,000. And they decided to invite as many people as possible to see what they described correctly, it turned out, as Soviet barbarism. And they hoped that they would be, the witnesses would make propaganda against the Soviets. They also put together three groups that became known, adopted the terms commission. One was the German Medical Commission, which was led by Dr. Butz, which remained on site during the entire exhumation, and they served as hosts of the premises. The second was an international technical commission. The Soviets had not allowed the International Red Cross to conduct an investigation. The Polish government had made an application to the International Red Cross in Switzerland to conduct an investigation. The Germans also did the same at the same time. And not only would Stalin not allow the investigation on Soviet territory, which the International Red Cross considered to be a prerequisite, but he used this as a grounds upon which to break off relations with the Polish government in exile. So the Germans ended up inviting about a dozen or so medical professionals from occupied countries to conduct medical exhumations, and that also included one doctor from a neutral country, being Switzerland. And there was also a group of Poles who were asked to participate in the exhumation of the bodies. And this group that became known as the Technical Commission of the Polish Red Cross was tasked with examining one by one each of the bodies, emptying the pockets, trying to identify the bodies, and putting the things that were discovered in the pockets into separate bags, which were envelopes, which were subsequently taken for examination. And in that process, they discovered many things, of course, besides wallets and so on. They also found many diaries and clues as to what happened, most notably the dates on various documents like newspapers. So the Soviets responded to this public um, exposure of this crime by immediately responding that this was not a Soviet crime, but a German crime, because the Poles had been left working on road construction in June of 1941 when they were captured by the Nazis during their rapid advance. And the Soviets suggested that the Nazis killed them in September of 1941. So the Poles then made that, as I indicate, that application to the IRC. The Soviets accused the Poles of collaboration and used that as a pretext for breaking relations. Now, the evidence that was available following all of the exhumations is summarized basically here. First of all, there's the inconsistent Soviet stories over the period from the time that the murders were taken place till the time of the discovery. When the Soviets were asked how are the Polish officers doing and where are they, every response always was inconsistent, which gave the impression that they had something to hide. Correspondence with the families ceased in the spring of 1940. The documents on all of the bodies were dated no later than May of 1940. And some of the diaries, in fact, included final entries that described very well what happened prior to the last bullet being shot. The clothing on the body was also a very interesting piece of evidence, because the coats and clothing suggested that they had been shot in cold weather and not warm weather like the summer of 1941, as the Soviets suggested. Furthermore, the clothing and the boots were in good shape. This was specifically noted by some of the English prisoners of the Nazis who were brought and witnessed the exhumations. In addition, many of the Poles who were executed apparently, tried to fight back and were stabbed with bayonets. And it turns out the marks were the four-cornered Soviet standard and not the flat Nazi blade. The medical specialists of the International Commission also were experts in the issue of decay of human tissue, including brains, and they were able to determine that the bodies had been there no less than 3 years. Also, there was no insects found in the graves, suggesting the burials took place in cold weather. Some of the victims' hands were tied with cord, and this turned out to be cord that was made in the USSR. On top of it all, in the wood, there were large trees everywhere except small trees where the graves were found. Now, the one thing that was a bit of a sort problem for the Nazis was that the ammunition that was discovered was German. And the Germans made it clear that the company that had produced it exported a lot to the East in the 1920s and 30s. No revolvers were found, but it's known now that the Soviets often preferred the Walter pistol than the Soviet Nagant pistol. Okay, 1943, the Soviets reconquered the area, and Merkulov, one of the senior NKVD officers, immediately went to work to prepare the area by interviewing the witnesses, getting them to recant their stories, and preparing them for what they were to say when the Soviet Commission would be set up. And in January of 1944, the Special State Commission for Ascertaining and Investigating the Circumstances of the Fascist Invaders' Murders was known as the Burdenko Commission, conducted their exhumations. And at the end, as the Nazis had invited witnesses, so did the Soviets. And so they invited a number of Western journalists to see the exhumations as well as the American ambassador's daughter. And the accounts written by these witnesses suggest that when they tried to ask probing questions, they were dismissed. So it didn't in the end end up being particularly impressive, but they weren't very well able to transfer this information to the West because of Soviet censorship. So in February of 1944, the Budenko Commission issued its report blaming the Nazis, and that the Budenko report became the Soviet official narrative on the Katyn massacre for the following decades until 1990. So the Soviet admission of responsibility first took place on the 13th of April, 1990, when Soviet President Gorbachev provided documentary evidence and laid blame at the door of the NKVD in Beria. And it was on the 14th of October, 1992, that Russian President Yeltsin provided the Polish President Walesa with a copy of Beria's memo of March 5th, 1940, with Stalin's signature on it. In 2000, there were Polish military cemeteries that were officially opened in Katyn and Mednoye and Piatychatki in Ukraine. I did a little bit of searching on the internet and came across this picture. This is a monument of the cemetery in the Piatychatki woods just outside Kharkov, and it's similar to the monuments in the other two military cemeteries. It's a wall, and although you can't see it in this picture, it is a wall which has engraved in it these names of all of the known victims. And I looked on the internet and was able to find one close-up picture of one part of this wall. And as I looked closer and closer at this part of the wall, you can see in the very top right corner, there is the name Stanisław Kawczak. I can tell you it was quite a feeling of, well, I wouldn't say joy, but it was one that had my heart stopped for a few moments as I realized my grandfather's name was on the monument. There it is, and blown up in the corner, right there. So that was part one of my presentation, an overview of the history of the Katyn Forest Massacre. Now what I'd like to do is describe some of the literature about it. There are two bibliographies, as far as I know, that have been written about Katyn literature. The first was by Zdzisław Jagodziński, who was a Pole who had the misfortune of spending some time in the Soviet Union during the war, and at the end of the war, made his way to London, became a librarian, wrote a number of books about Polish history and a couple of bibliographies. And in 1976, he wrote and published this one Katyn bibliography that was 16 pages long, which listed books and only just their bibliographic citations without any annotation or discussion of the author. And it contained books that were in multiple languages, not just Polish and German, but also some Russian, some French, English, Dutch, and Italian. In 1982, he released a revised and enlarged edition, which was 48 pages long. And it was a very useful bibliographic source. When I was growing up as a boy, my father had 3 or 4 books on Katyn. And a couple of years ago, I suddenly got this tremendous urge to go through them and learn everything I could about Katyn. And in the process, I decided to explore what else had been published, particularly since the Soviet admission of guilt, because my father had a 1962 book by Professor Zavodny, which was the classic historical scholarly assessment of the Katyn evidence. And I wanted to know what else had been published. So I started to look for all the English books that had been published and were available. I found over 40. I decided to write this book, which is an annotated bibliography. So there is a chapter that outlines the history of the massacre, a chapter that describes the literature, and then each chapter describes a different author and their books. The most authors just have one book on the topic of Katyn, but there are a few who have several. So it's a total of 31 authors and 38 books. There's a few books that I had in my collection, which I decided not to include because they were works of denial and historic falsification, which I didn't think were worthy of being admitted or listed in this bibliography. So the nature of the books in English about Katyn, I think you can divide into several different categories. First, there are those studies and compilations of facts that were put together before the Soviet admission of responsibility in 1990, and then those that were assembled afterwards. And there was a brief period of time during the Yeltsin era when the Russian archives were open to historians. Then there are political memoirs by politicians, diplomats, and military officials, each of which can give a particular missing piece of the historic puzzle. Then there are memoirs from the former prisoners. And by those, I mean, of course, those 400 who were not executed, but who were sent to the Gryazovets camp. And there's, of course, one, Professor Shvanievich, that we'll discuss, who was not sent to Gryazovets, but instead to Lubyanka and then to the Gulag. And he survived and wrote a wonderful book, which I'll discuss in a minute. Then there are a number of books that were written by witnesses to the exhumations. Now, these are witnesses that were either brought by the Nazis or those that were brought in 1944 by the Soviets. Now, the witnesses, depending on what their background was and in which party they were involved in, had different perspectives and either wrote reports internally for their own organization when they came back, whether it was, soldiers who were prisoners of war and after the war were released, or if they were, underground agents from the Polish Home Army underground who then reported back to the Home Army. All of these reports were kept internally, but some books were subsequently written by some of them. Then there are some books written by the experiences of the families. And these provide also a perspective and some clues as to what happened to the fathers who went missing. And there's one particular subject that's quite a unique, and it's the aerial photography of the Katyn forest. And I'll get to that in a moment. So the first of the, I'm only going to give now a snapshot with the little time that I have left of some of the highlights. But the first one that has to be mentioned is Joseph Chapsky. Now, Joseph Chapsky was an officer at Starobielsk who was transferred to Gryazovets, so he avoided being executed, joined the Anders army when it was being formed, and was given the task by General Anders of searching for the officers. He ended up writing in 1944 a book in Polish called Wspomnienia Starobielskie, which was subsequently translated, and I have here the copy, the cover of the French version, Souvenirs de Starobielsk. even though it's not in English, I include it because it's such an important book. But I'm happy to say the New York Review of Book Publishers are in the process of having it translated. They announced last year that an English version was going to be published in November. It has been delayed, I presume, because of COVID, and is now expected to be published in June of this year. So it's definitely on my reading list, but I have the French version. And in 1951, he also wrote this book called The Inhuman Land. Now, I can't give you too much of the anecdotes from these stories, but just to give one example of the horrors that the Soviets imposed upon the Poles, he describes how in Souvenir de Starobielsk, how he was required to attend these midnight interrogations. And he had been a painter in France during the late 20s and early 30s. He went to Paris to study painting. And his NKVD interrogators insisted on his divulging what military assignment had he been given. They assumed that he had been sent to paint maps of Paris for the Polish military as a spying mission. And even though he tried to convince them that one could spend just a few centimes at any street corner in Paris to buy a map of Paris, they didn't believe him. And the next book, The Inhuman Land, provides countless episodes and examples of the fruitlessness of asking Soviet officials what happened to the Polish missing officers. The next book in this category is General Anders' 1949 book, An Army in Exile. And this is, of course, a beautiful book, and I highly recommend it to all young Polish people and to all history students who are really interested in a different story from the standard Western perspective on the war. So he gives an outline of his experiences and, of course, the forming of the army and how he managed to help them escape. And then it culminated in the great success at the Battle of Monte Cassino. But there are several passages, including a chapter on the issue of Katyn. And in one of the episodes, he discusses how in December 3rd, 1941, Sikorski, the president and general from the government in exile, who came to Russia and went to the Kremlin with Anders and with Ambassador Koch to meet with Stalin to discuss the formation of the army and the supplies for the army, but also to ask, where are the missing officers? And he describes in his book how Stalin at one point insisted that they had escaped. And when Anders asked where could they possibly have escaped to? The response that Stalin provided was Manchuria. So this shows some of the absurdities that the Soviets were capable of doing, even at the highest level. So here's a picture of the meeting at that time. And you see behind Stalin from the right, there's Molotov, Sikorski, Ambassador Koch, and next to him, General Anders. And on the left side, I think it's just a bunch of Soviet communists. This picture is also used on the cover of Ambassador Koch's book, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, the next book that provides some interesting insights into the Katyn massacre and guilt is the memoirs of Tadeusz Komorowski, who was the head of the Polish Home Army and Polish Underground. So when the Nazis sought from the Poles some people who would be willing to go to Katyn to participate in the exhumations, his organization managed to get a couple of agents into the Polish delegation. And they took a number of things from Katyn and brought them back to Warsaw, including some of the rope and the bullets, but also some of the retrieved diaries. And Bor Komorowski says that the first memo that was secretly sent to the Polish government in exile described what was found, but did not assign any statement of guilt. However, he says that after he read the diaries that were retrieved and brought back, he had absolutely no doubt about who was responsible. It was, from his perspective, an open and shut case that the Soviets were responsible. Now, here's probably the first book written in English specifically on the Katyn Wood murders, and not a book like the other ones, which just is an episode or a chapter. Józef Mackiewicz was a Polish journalist who was invited to witness the exhumations by the Nazis. And after the war, he returned from Poland. He escaped in January of 45 to Italy and joined the Anders Army and worked in their documentation center, and so was able to provide his report of what he had seen and witnessed, and also compile evidence and information from other sources that were in this documentation center. And he ended up writing this book. Now, one of the interesting things that he added was that newspapers were extremely valuable to prisoners in the camps, because newspapers could be used to wrap things or to fold as a purse or like a wallet, or it could be used as rolling paper for cigarettes, or as extra insulation for like socks in boots or shoes. And he said that during the exhumations, when they were opening the pockets, he said there was a tremendous amount of newspaper coming out. There was even newspaper blowing in the wind as these bodies were taken out of the graves. But he said that he noticed that all of the dates on the newspapers were never past May of 1940. And so the suggestion that they were only killed in September of 1941 made no sense, because the newspapers would have not lasted that long. And of course, why would the soldiers hold on to year-old newspapers when they could presumably get new ones? So for him, just the abundance of newspapers ending on those dates in the April and May of 1940 was enough to convince him for sure that this was in fact a Soviet crime. Now, the Madden Commission, this is very interesting. As the ambassador said earlier, the Western allies were very much willing to suppress the Katyn story and any allegations of Soviet responsibility, because they were desperate for not only the Soviets, they feared the possibility that the Soviets and the Nazis would make another peace deal, which after Stalingrad was highly unlikely. But they also wanted the Soviets to keep fighting, and so they didn't want to antagonize Stalin. However, there's a long story behind what launched the Madden Commission, committee, which was just one committee of the House of Representatives that decided to investigate the Katyn Forest massacre. They did an absolutely tremendous job over a period of, it could cover 2 years. They heard from 103 witnesses, including General Anders and Bor Komorowski and Joseph Chapsky. They heard received lots of exhibits and depositions. They held hearings not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And in the end, they published the transcripts. It was 2,600 pages. And the final unnumbered volume, eighth volume, was the final conclusions. And their conclusion basically was that the Soviets were guilty of the murders, which couldn't have occurred later than 1940. They also concluded, after having studied how the Americans had dealt with the Van Viet report, who was one of the witnesses whose report right after the war that was given to the Pentagon was suppressed and mysteriously disappeared, how there was this strange sort of psychosis that this matter was to be suppressed. Now, there was the belief at the end of the war that the Americans very much wanted the Soviets to become engaged in the struggle against Japan, and also they did not want to jeopardize their participation in the forming of the UN. But in the process, historical truth paid the price and was suppressed, and this committee exposed that. The committee also recommended that the House refer the matter to the UN and request a trial before the International Court of Justice at The Hague, and that recommendation was not acted on. Now, 1962, Janusz Zawodny was a Polish soldier, a historian, an academic. After the war, he went to England and then the United States, where he was a professor. And he wrote this book, which is an absolute classic in the history of Katyn literature, called Death in the Forest, the story of the Katyn Forest massacre, which analyzed all of the information available to date and presented it in a scholarly academic style, but still very much one that anyone could read in a popular sort of book. And it's a classic which came to the conclusion, of course, that the Soviets were responsible. And this book has certainly withstood the test of time and is definitely a significant addition to the Katyn literature library. Now, Stanisław Kot was the Polish ambassador to the Soviet Union during a period in the Second World War. Unfortunately, he did not speak Russian. So whenever he had meetings with Wyszynski or Molotov or Stalin, he always had a secretary and a translator to come along. And afterwards, they always wrote memos and reports of their meetings. Now, in this book, which you see has the same picture from the December 3rd, 1941 meeting of Sikorski, Kot, and Anders with Stalin and Molotov, apart from his introductory chapter in which he describes his experience, the rest of the book is just a series of reports from these various meetings. And some of them are absolutely fascinating because in many of the meetings with Molotov and Stalin and Wyszynski, he repeatedly asks, where are the missing officers? And so the responses that he got, it's a catalog of deception and falsehoods and outright lies. At one point, prior to Sikorski coming to Moscow for that December meeting, Kot provides one example of how he met with Molotov and Stalin to discuss the preparations for the meeting. And he mentioned that, there's still the issue of the missing officers. So Stalin, in a piece of, really unbecoming theatrics for somebody who was a head of state, walked over to a desk where there was a phone, called some office and said, Stalin here, I have the Polish ambassador. He says, not all the Poles have been released. Have they been released? And he waits on the phone. And then he came back to the desk and he mumbled, he hung up and then came back. And then the phone rang. And then he went back to the phone, listened to what he was told. And Koch says that he came back to the discussions with him, mumbling under his breath that he was told that they had all been released. Of course, none of that was true. Now, one of the things that the documentation center of the Anders Army did, of course, was compile all this information about what happened at Katyn and all of the various pieces of this puzzle. And at the end of the war, it was published in Polish, and one edition was published, but it was not for public circulation. It was meant only for some politicians. However, the English translation of the Polish edition was also apparently meant for eventual public dissemination, but it was not released until 1965. And it contains an introductory chapter by General Anders, in which he says that the compilation of this book with all the facts and documents known about Katyn is meant to arouse public consciousness around the world and hopefully lead to some tribunal or judicial action to see that justice is done. Now, the book contains such a collection of reports and stories from witnesses and so on that it's very conclusive. When you read it, it's very obvious who's responsible for this crime. But significantly, Anders says there's no concluding chapter like the summation that a lawyer would do to a jury in a trial, because the facts speak for themselves and it's up to the reader to make a decision. Now, even though this book did not result in any, international court of justice action on the Katyn case, it did have a very interesting effect with regards to influence on one particular British naval officer by the name of Louis Fitzgibbon. Louis Fitzgibbon doesn't have any Polish background, but evidently really liked Poland and learned to speak the language. When he got this book, when he was visiting a Polish cultural center, it was given to him as a gift. He became obsessed almost with this particular episode and ended up writing 5 books about it during the 1970s, which really contributed to a renewal of awareness about Katyn and bringing it to the attention of mostly the British public. So one book, the first one, Katyn, A Crime Without Parallel, had a tremendous impact in the media. And the next book, The Katyn Cover-Up, has some examples of political speeches that were made, but also the 30-year rule kicked in, which involved the public release of previously classified documents from the British archives, some of which involved the English ambassador, Owen O'Malley, his reports. He's the ambassador to the Polish government in exile. He wrote some phenomenal reports about assessing, the Katyn situation for the British government. And these were published. And he wrote 2 other books, again, following up, many with, transcripts from the Madden Committee hearings. And then he joined this one committee that was actively working towards erecting a monument. And my understanding, the first monument in the West for Katyn was erected in the 50s in Stockholm, but the first one in England was this one erected in a cemetery in West London in 1976. Now, Wacław Gołęba Maliszewski. This is a fascinating story. Mr. Maliszewski's father's, I think it's his cousin, was one of the victims of Katyn. Mr. Gołęba Maliszewski was born in Scotland and then moved to America. So he lives in the East Coast. And what happened during the war was the Germans made many Luftwaffe Air Force reconnaissance sorties over Soviet territory. And there are approximately 17 times they flew over the Katyn area before their occupation, and then after the Soviets reoccupied it. And what happened was a CIA analyst once did an assessment of that in the, I think it was in the 70s, but his report was classified. However, Mr. Goziemba-Malishevsky got a copy of it and decided to pursue it and ask for, in the archives to see these actual films that had been made by the German Air Force. And he did a thorough, over a span of 10 years, analysis and discovered basically that the Soviets, after they had reconquered the area, had changed the landscape a lot and repositioned the bodies and the mass graves in an effort to cover it up. And he also came up with a theory of the actual location where the executions at Katyn took place. So this book was actually published as part of a series in a Polish academic journal, but it's a standalone subject matter. And Mr. Goziemba-Malishevsky has a Facebook group called Stalin and Sites, Katyn and Sites of Stalin's Crimes. And you can contact him and get a copy or a link to the electronic version of this book on the internet. Now, this next book, this one is a classic. This is Stanisław Szwaniewicz's book. He was a Polish economist who had studied Nazi economics and Soviet economics before the war. He was held at Kozielsk, was on the train to Gniezdovo one day where he was to be executed with everybody else in the train. But at the last minute, he was the subject of a recall from Moscow, and he was sent to Lubyanka and then to the Gulag. Then he was released to the Anders Army, came to the West, and it was a professor in the West, including a period of time in Canada. But when he was held back and taken off the train, he managed to observe the process by which the Soviet NKVD was having the buses, blacked out buses, come to the train, load up a busload of Polish officers, take them away in the woods, and then half an hour later return empty for more. And so he recounted this in his memoirs in 1976, and his son, Witold, translated it and published this book in 2002. And when I published my annotated bibliography last year, and I made a note of it on Facebook, I got a message from somebody who asked me the question, did you include Stanisław Szwaniewicz's book In the Shadow of Katyn, Stalin's Terror? And I responded, I said, yes, of course, it's one of the classics. And I asked the lady, and who are you? And it turned out it was Stanisław Szwaniewicz's daughter, or granddaughter, the daughter of the translator, the son Witold. So that's one of the things that one does with the internet and Facebook is connect with all these people who also have a connection to Katyn. George Sanford, this book is one of the most interesting academic and scholarly books published in 2005 by a professor in the UK who obviously studied this matter quite intensely for a prolonged period. This is a wonderful narrative, a study of Polish, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland is a chapter, and he describes the Soviet policies towards Poland. And then he describes, basically what happened before the Katyn massacre, how they were treated in the camps, and then what happened during the massacre. This is the first time I came across a thorough discussion of the logistics, including the names of the actual assassins, the executioners, the killers, and then, of course, the discussion afterwards of how the Western governments, particularly the British and the Americans, suppressed the Catton story. For example, Churchill won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and one of his most famous books, of course, is his massive tome of volumes on his history of World War II. And George Sanford says that Churchill was positively misleading in his memoirs when discussing the Catton story, because he wanted to keep this open verdict, of uncertainty about the true culprits of the crime alive. Now, this book is the ultimate Bible. If you're only going to read one book and you want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, with all of the original sources, Catton, A Crime Without Punishment, published in 2007 by Yale University Press, written by Anna Cinchala, Wojciech Materski, and Natalia Lebedeva. Unfortunately, we couldn't find a picture of Mrs. Lebedeva, but she's an American, Russian archivist. In this book, they provide 122 translated documents from the Soviet archives, including the translation of the March 5th, 1940 signed order of Stalin on Beria's memo, and all of the documents before, during, and after about the cover-up and the efforts of the Soviets to suppress the story and so on in the Western media. So this is probably the most important book. Now, there's only a few more. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll try to rush here. Alan Paul's book on Catton. This is another example, like Louis Fitzgibbon, of a person who's not of Polish background, but who became fascinated with the story and wrote an absolutely wonderful book. This is a wonderful popular history based on all of his research. His first edition was in 1991, and it became a bestseller and went through several editions. I recommend the most recent edition of 2010 because it includes information revealed in the 2007 book that I just referred to of Anna Cinchala, Materski, and Lebedeva. What makes this book also interesting, besides a comprehensive history, is that he focuses also on the personal stories of 3 families that were affected by having the father as an officer who was among the victims in Catton. Eugenia Mereš was a Pole from Vilno before the war, survived the Gulag, got out with the Anders army, ended up being a physicist in England, and she wrote this absolutely wonderful book, Catton 1940, The Documentary Evidence of the West's Betrayal. I highly recommend this book. She did a lot of searching in the archives and compiled a massive collection of internal Polish reports and memos, as well as the English reports and internal memos of the Foreign Office and various government officials, all of which consistently demonstrate a willingness of the British government to suppress the Catton story. Then there's the story by Krystyna Piotrkowska, this book, English-Speaking Witnesses to Catton, Recent Research. So Krystyna Piotrkowska lives in New York, and she came to Ottawa to speak to us a few years ago. She, at one point, worked at the Polish War Museum in Warsaw, and it was suggested to her that she might study and do some research on the English-speaking witnesses. So these were the English and the British Commonwealth allies and the Americans who were prisoners of war and brought by the Germans to Katyn, and what happened afterwards. So she discovered that many of them wrote reports for their respective armies and governments, but were basically told to keep quiet and hush up. So many of them did. But one of them, a civilian, and in this picture that's on the cover, you see on the left, there's one man wearing a suit. He ended up writing a book in 1968 with 2 chapters on his trip to Katyn. He was an English civilian, but I don't have enough time here to speak about that book. Now we're closing in on the end. Tadeusz Wodza, this is one of the most recent books. This is an English translation of his Polish book, Encounter with Katyn. What he tried to do is identify all of the Poles who were brought by the Nazis to Katyn and discover what was their story afterwards of how they were harassed by the Germans, not only to do propaganda, but also harassed by the Soviets afterwards to shut them up. And many of them suffered tremendously in their lives and their careers, and a few of them managed to escape to the West. There's another book that was published recently about Katyn by a German journalist in Warsaw, and there's another one called Surviving Katyn that is expected to be published in the summer. So this just goes to show that the literature on Katyn continues to reveal some secrets. Now, conclusion, what are the unresolved issues? So first of all, despite the Soviet and Russian investigation in the 1990s, no one has been charged with any related crime or held to account. There's been no symbolic offer of compensation. Relevant documents that were have not all been released from the investigations that took place by the Soviet military investigations and the Russian military investigations in the 1990s. Now, what is the reason for the secrecy? Why is it that they are not releasing all of these documents? And where are the graves of the other victims from the 1940 executions from Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, the 7,305 that Shelepin referred to in his 1959 memo to Khrushchev. So for those of you who'd like more information, I highly recommend, but I admit that I'm biased, my book, which is available on Amazon. Thank you very much.